So to bring you into the session, we're in the midst of a conversation that kind of took us towards the concepts, or rather operations, we are bringing to the board. You could also think of them about them as mechanics of the game, and going through their functionality towards like maybe the two issues that are on topic is modularity versus let's say the interoperability and the natures of interoperability that are in play or are possible. And this is all in a way prelude before play and text, but also important enough to talk about. And that's, I would say, is a sort of summary of where we are. But what I wanted to say, so in terms of these concepts, the kind of layer filter, which was now in the Notion document called framer, which is not set, but underneath the framer you find the boss definition that it's something that behaves like a layer and all the qualities that we have put to it, and it behaves like a filter. But it would be good to find some common name to it. But nevertheless, the qualities are more important than the name currently, I would say. So what one quality about this sort of layer filter likeness was, like in the play that we had earlier, like essentially these moves create something that is like a layer filter. Like so we're like, if we created like some addition, like first we had the stuff, we had the rules of scroll in a sensible way, which are in the left top corner, which were simply a starting point, and as a kind of experiment throwing in two images which were also like potential starting points. But then like when a move was made, add the image is a snapshot and it was placed near this image, this in itself creates a layer filter. And what does it mean? Well, it means that it could move in other places. It could, and it's definitely filtering the situation, that its addition is affecting the whole board. It's affecting particularly, say, this image. Now it's a snapshot, and its origin, it was only white blocks. So now it filters this image, and of course this image filters this text in itself. So there's the filter behavior. Then the layer behavior is more like, still I think the Photoshop metaphor is the best here, is this like layer can be moved up and down, turned off, turned on. Like this could be, we could play forward and turn this layer off and see how the situation changes. All this kind of thinking, the kind of flexibility of it is useful. So in a way, like you could say that the layer filter is behavior. It's a behavior type. It's almost like species of behavior. But then, like, it's useful still to think like what other things are at play here. And of course, one easy thing would be to say that this whole thing we're in, what we acknowledge to be the situation, that's the scene. Like, and this is not really outside of the definitions we used for the scene earlier. So you could say that the layer filters are in a scene. You could also say that the scene itself behaves like a layer filter, because the types here are perspectivist. Now we come to the, like everything is a layer filter. Everything is potentially a scene. Everything is potentially a type. Nothing is. Everything is just use. So, but if something is put into the perspective that this is the scene now, like this whole thing, and this is a layer filter I put here, that creates a play situation. Like I could also say, okay, this scene is now a layer filter for some other game, and that would be completely possible. But to be able to point out that scene is a different behavior, which is kind of more like this canvas, but also like scene in kind of this traditional sense of everything that is at play, the active context of process. Having that benefits, it brings you into a different thinking of the process than the layer filter does. So yes, that was potentially.
Can you say that very? Can you say that very last sentence, last part again?
Like the last sentence, like it brings you into different points of processing or thinking than the layer filter does. Like the scene brings you into a different point of processing and thinking than the layer filter.
Right. So kind of what you're saying is kind of attaching this kind of, so because the layer filter mechanic, metaphor, whatever, is a rather blank, like it doesn't move much, it doesn't provide much beyond this kind of basic operation.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, which is important.
It's kind of blank. Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
yes. And so what you're saying is like if you now kind of, so to say, embellish that which is one of these layer filters with specific kind of capacities, you maintain the layer filter interoperability while you gain kind of specificity for their, like, you know, the activity or like effect in operation.
Yeah.
Do I understand you well? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. I get that, and I think that was also nothing that I kind of felt to disagree with, in a sense that, like, of course, I mean, when we like, maybe I can bring back from the kind of pre-recording age of the session, these three notions of, like, just example of like network topology and translucency. If we bring these in, they also are kind of characteristically qualified.
Yes.
Each of them does something kind of specific, which the other one does not do, but the way that they kind of relate and respond to one another may still very well be a layering and filtering interaction. So I think here we agree.
Yeah, like they can be perspectives, but it's useful, just like to use a traditional example, like to design a game like chess or really any game. The fact that you have this sort of conception of a board and the conception of pieces is useful, that you can move your processing in different ways and have this sort of structural typology, and that in itself is useful. And what the definition here, maybe I'll change the sharing. I'll move to the actually I don't have to change the sharing because we're still in yes in the browser. So these are kind of attempts to find this sort of family of behaviors of that can not only like, or can expand around the kind of layer filter like behavior. That the layer filters are not just like pieces floating upon empty. There is this sort of uncertain, undefined ground around it, but like what kind of other behaviors are useful for it? So the scene is a good example because it points out that actually sometimes it's very good to think about something as more like not just a canvas, but really a context. And scene, I think, is still one of the better conceptions of that, because it has this sort of board-like quality, but it also has this, like a scene in a theater is like, it's really kind of like a world, but in the sense of active context.
Is there any way, Pekka, in which scene would not be a hierarchical thing?
So, okay, it's a big can of worms, because I think the problem with hierarchy is not hierarchy per se, it's static hierarchy. Actually, hierarchy is very useful sometimes. but you need.
This is not an ideological question, to be sure, right? Like, so I'm not like, I want because I'm so anti-authoritarian or so. That's not my problem at all. It's a question of how things work upon one another. So like, because like I tell you my intuition that a room would like a room like the one that I'm sitting in, like in real life, would be more kind of, one would be more inclined to call the room a scene than the lamp that is standing here next to me. However, I think in terms of perception of the situation, it might be rather hard to define which is the one actually setting the scene. As a kind of, you know, what's the main framing that is happening here? And so this is where my problem with the hierarchy comes in, not because one shouldn't have it. The question is like, is it really easy to kind of establish which of the ones is the scene? You know, if I go and talk about a dungeon setting or something, you know, if I say the color of the dungeon is fluorescent pink, which is the scene now?
That in itself, this brings in the perspectivism and why I think hierarchy is misleading. I don't think we need even the term hierarchy, because hierarchy is an artificial way of talking about power without defining what's actually happening. The scene is not hierarchically above, it does a certain operation. It can be seen as hierarchy, but that's misleading. The main
but
point,
isn't it what I'm trying to say here?
wait, yeah,
sorry,
but the point is, like, you make it now hierarchy, and it's not really helping in the sense of it's more about it being a scene, and calling it hierarchy as moving it away of what it actually does to just talking about power in an abstract sense. Like, is the scene that something works like a scene? Is that that's not really merely a question of power. You could say that it is power that is in a way hosting these things, but the key thing where one should put one focus is what it's doing in this sense. Like, and here's where the perspectivism comes in. Like, nothing is a layer filter, nothing is a scene, but it's the point of whether using or utilizing it as a layer filter or a scene is currently useful. So then the question which you just made, what is the scene, is kind of the wrong question. It's
exactly more that's what I was trying to say. That is exactly the wrong question.
Yeah. Hence the perspectivism, and hence the drive to create a purely perspectivist system.
So my point here, just can I comment in between? So my point being exactly this, what you just said. What is the scene is exactly the question we don't need. So the question for me is, what do we do here with this term scene? Why are we trying to have it? Because, like, if it were an observational term, maybe that's where you are going with this perspectivism. I don't know that yet. I missed the last session. I'm so sorry for being sand in the gearbox here. But if the scene is something that kind of happens, or even kind of is kind of emerges from the combination of, you know, multiple layers and so stuff, then I get it. Then at some point you can say, I guess we're in a scene right now. But as an element that you would play or bring on or name and say, like, now I introduce a scene, that's I just feel that, like, it's not needed.
But that's precisely the thing, that sometimes you want to bring the combination of the thing. Like, I don't think it's an accident that that there is kind of almost like more and more like accentuation on the scene in, say, role-playing, which has all kinds of things that are like from player characters to items. It has, which behave kind of like layer filters, but there's still this need of, I actually want to create a situation which is a combination of these characters and this item on the ground, and the ground being this, and this being the room. And it's all of that configuration together, and then that's all as an active process, each one affecting, co-affecting each other, that being the scene. And that's the focus of the scene, that behavior. And I do think that that's common, and that's kind of, in a way, growing because of the need of that. Like, and once again, if it's perspective, you can the scene itself can be treated as a layer filter, certainly. But it's sometimes useful to say, okay, this is the scene now, which makes people think, it's this interplay of all these elements and how they set a current process or configuration of the process.
But that's I think the way that you've been saying this now, and just that statement, these statements that you just made, I think there was a kind of fine difference between stuff, like, and I don't have the sharpness right now to repeat it, but this kind of emergent, the scene as something emergent would appear to me to play nicely and kind of also then meaningfully with this kind of layer filter approach, because I understand that we seek to expand and maybe increase the definition of this approach, but like as we do that, it's very good to test also like how these other ideas play with that. And I think the scene as an emergent would be kind of it would feel like congruent in some sense.
I mean, the scene must be able to be emergent, and
Yes.
this is, by the way, true of role-playing games in itself. But if it's only emergent, that is not enough. That's too stiff, because if you are not able to say, okay, now the scene is this, you're taking away certain elements of creativity. And this is precisely, I think, why role-playing games contain this, that you almost set the scene as almost like a portal to jump in, and immediately when you enter the scene starts to mutate, that it starts to emerge as its own variation.
Yeah.
But if you don't have this possibility to set the scene, you're limiting yourself.
Because you never can take a second step in a sense.
Yeah. So and you can never, or there's a certain shift you can make. Like there are people, for example, in the role-playing ground who are very kind of like, they might set the beginning scene, but every scene after that kind of emerges. There's no cuts as in film sets. But you also have people who are very much into this, like we actually kind of capsulate the scene, and then once we found it kind of have exhausted certain interestingness or elements we wanted, we actually set another scene and really make a cut. And the point is not to tell this is better than this is better, but that these are two approaches that bring different qualities, and those qualities can serve different purposes. So in a way, like the whole, like that, all of that has to be possible, and that's kind of like also in this idea of a scene, especially if you treat it kind of in this perspectivist manner, you could first of all set the scene, you could let the scene continue, that it's really like a doorway which you jump through and then it starts to evolve by itself. But you could even freeze frame or save. Like you could say, oh, now this situation, we stop it here. We say this is here, and we kind of make a save, a capture out of it, and then becomes a scene for maybe somebody else or later play or whatever. So all of this is kind of expanding your possibilities to operate with it, which is like, which is not anti-emergence. The emergence is still just as possible there, but it's also introducing other possibilities, which then expand the expressive space that you have.
Yeah, I think the way this is composed is just crucial to be specific about and precise in a way about, because and again, like some of this might come because I missed the session, but if it kind of sits as it now does, and it like, yeah, okay, yeah, but anyway, I think there were some now good points. I think because a scene as like something that you just kind of cut in at any point of the thing makes, to me, perfect sense. It would not make perfect sense if it were based on, kind of any kind of spatial, like, analogy in terms of, oh, it's a big thing, so it must be a scene. It's a small, I mean, if we think of those moments that we spoke, that we played with Michael and his Milestone thing, for example, I'm not sure if we did say a scene, or if we kind of put it together and then it was the scene at some point and we kind of knew it, or I don't know, if somebody said it and then somebody pushed play or something. But that to me, that session very much, in a sense, felt like a layering approach.
Yes, in the heart of it, in the kind of like, in the game terms, it would be like the core loop. It's the one that is kind of in the middle, chugging and chugging away. That's very much this sort of layer filter behavior. And that was kind of the whole idea is like, okay, if this is kind of the core of it, how can you support it? And for example, the scene is then a way to support it, but to create expansions on it, create points of introducing such a thing, like saving such a thing, and also kind of putting the, being able to move to the perspective again of like, okay, let's actually now look at this as a whole, as a frozen unit floating in front of us, like, and let's look at this interplay from that position. Like, you don't have to do that. There's nothing in there saying, okay, this is the way it has to be done, but being able to do that is in itself useful. And this is kind of what I was talking about, to refer earlier talks with this, how this sort of Obsidian, etc., and also Notion, this modular approach, is kind of building one leg, and then having this sort of, let's still call it Arboreal, this sort of as you could think that like this playing here, playing situation is Arboreal, is building another leg.
That but I'm not. Is that what is that the way that we're using these terms? Because to me, Notion would be the Arboreal.
Okay, yeah.
Logic.
Then, okay. Then we have just a like missyncing of terms. We would need a term. I was meaning it as in this sense of contrary to the Notion, like, or contrary to this.
Because Arboreal means kind of trunk, branches, smaller branches, right? So
you were thinking it this way. Yeah, I would. Okay, we definitely need to set the terms, like, because
because you were thinking rhizomatic in a way, or not? No.
Yeah, because like I don't like rhizomatic as a term. Now we're getting to like super, like, for many reasons. Like, the rhizomatic is just saying network, especially in its current meaning. And I was thinking, Pablo, when you brought in Arboreal, you were thinking of the kind of like I was almost taking this outside of view of a forest, and then I was thinking that you have this sort of network that opens up into a full picture of a forest. Like, underneath you have this sort of branching pathways, but then that actually builds the forest in itself. So I was making jumps that I should have mentioned in this.
Also interesting though.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I wish I meant that, but no, I wish I did. But I meant the boring understanding of Arboreal, as Martin described it, in opposition to rhizomatic, just like as a post-structuralist divide of how to see, right?
But as a general use, it's misleading. Like, I think, I don't know, oceanic, still not good. But like, we definitely would need this term. But like, how this?
But I think if we want to have a kind of top level term for this, then I think our filter layer is not far from that. I think that's the thing.
Yeah,
I think it's not top level. Once again, entirely, it's more like core loop level. It's like once again, it's like at the center, not at the top. Like it. Or
let's say, okay, let's delete the word top, but the same, like a similar level as Arboreal or rhizomatic. I think that the filter layer one is right there. That's the same league.
Okay, yeah, I agree with you. I also feel bad for all the viewers because we're super abstract, but this is very interesting and important. But nevertheless,
you can always press stop and watch something.
I actually adjust, and I think you're right. And I think you're right for the following reason: is because precisely calling it kind of or looking at it both as a layer, which is really kind of like the layer part is kind of like wanting to introduce extra flexibility to the modularity that, say, Notion uses. via the metaphor of the Photoshop filter, which is kind of similarly a model as the, say, a text block, as they call them in say Notion, but it has clearly the sort of like much more flexibility, movability, turn off, on, etc. But then the filter part of the definition is about its unavoidable relation with context. That it comes as a filter, just like a chess piece comes on the board of chess, or when it moves, lands in a certain position. It's a filter because it's all about its effect on the game and the game's effect on it. So in this sense, I think you're right that it's actually bridging both sides, because it wants, with these two terms, layer and filter, kind of nod its head to both directions. So, and that's probably why it became, or one of the reasons why it became so useful. It's because it was kind of doing this kind of like serving both sides, like, and moving both legs, essentially. And this is also why I think like this sort of almost like this approach of extremities, like this sort of block sense of modularity versus this sort of holistic, I'm still looking for the word, sense of co-effect, context likeness, is important to serve the both sides.
Context likeness is very good also.
Yeah, and this is kind of like trying to have this serving of both sides is kind of the key aspect here in this different behaviors, these different perspectives towards this whole like in addition to the layer filter, which here was with the name candidate framer, might not be good, but let's not dive into those questions. But the one, for example, is the typer, which means there's, okay, what kind of types do we have? Like, okay, we have moves and rolls and writes, for example, and those are types. So this is really like almost like creating a dimension. Like you put like a role in itself can be treated as a type, and then there is like many different roles branching out of there, but it creates this possibility of kind of creating species from a point, like a pocket dimension in itself.
But do we need a typer? Do we just not need awareness of that there are types? Do we need a type? Is there like a generator for types other than the three of us, or like the however want to join?
I don't have actually a strong opinion. This was merely a kind of experiment. Should they all be turned into operative terms?
Right.
But I'm not kind of like strong on that. And I'm certainly not the fan of the setter, which is about the setting, which is the network around the scene. And this is something we've actually processed a lot in the last few sessions, because
but is it necessary? Because it scales, right? I mean, the thing that I find beautiful about the filter layer thing is that I can put, let's say, I create a role filter layer by writing whatever the role is on a handkerchief.
Yes.
And putting it in my pocket. And then I step outside, and at some point I pull that filter layer out, and it tells me what is the role that I now have.
Yes.
And suddenly that which I find myself in has been set that way. So is there an outside to the scene, or does it just kind of scale, escalate? Aren't we kind of moving through at least like 4 dimensions right now with this rather fluidly while still retaining precision?
Yes and no. There is and this has been a like
Damn.
that. I mean, the best answer ever. Yes and no. But anyway, like this was actually kind
Keep
of my
all
hope.
options open.
This was kind of my hope. Like, okay, there is no need for setting. Like, let's all make it like expand to the scene. But then the more I thought about it, the more it actually made itself
superfluous.
less like vital. And the key thing about it is, let's see, like one approach towards this is, okay, scene in the terms of also the human process is this kind of like, what are all the things that are affecting each other in this process? And it's a sort of active, like chess game is once again a good example. You have this sort of frame of the chessboard, is like it's created as this context that you kind of, you're even showing your skill that you can think about all the combinations and interplays, and that forms the scene in itself. But that is also limited because our brain cannot create an active context like a scene for everything. So we have other approaches, and those approaches actually take quite different structures when we go beyond that, this sort of active context sense. And that's where the setting comes into play. And this is...
Do you mean it's a delimiter or what? Like an attention delimiter, or what is it that you mean?
It's a contour, and there is a kind of intentional contouring like in the scene. And we do that for a reason. Like there is this danger, like in a way, we could say the whole world is a scene, but practically it doesn't work that way. And like you could say, well, actually,
it's for resources and meaning, right? It's for resources and meaning that you draw that contour.
Yeah. And because we cannot do this sort of active scene-like operation to everything, our operations beyond that actually start to behave quite differently. And like the roughest way to say it would be that they actually become more network-like. And maybe a best practical example of this, which is kind of where the setting idea started to build from, is this. If I look at the behavior of worlds in internet cultures, in role-playing, like not just this sort of commercial settings like Forgotten Realms or whatever, but I'm looking at, say, people sharing a setting with each other and having their own games, their own instances, playing with their own groups, but still sharing a setting. What is actually happening there? And it certainly is not encompassed in the scene. Like, for example, like, okay, like in the setting, somebody creates a city, and then they relate it in a very network-like manner by saying it's on a certain point in the map, which is a relation. And then they describe the city by certain, they cannot make the whole city, but they describe, say, here's some important houses, and here's a map, and here's some people in it. But that's very much a threaded network in itself, like what they create, because they cannot create the whole city. And once again, they cannot make it into a scene in this sense. So they make this sort of network, thread work, words that come in the setting definition. But then another interesting thing that happens is, say, in the city, there is a particular house, maybe it's selling something, and somebody likes the city, so their players in their session visit that house, but they're kind of creating an instance out of that house because it might just float up above it, and they play with, like, say, buying all the, I don't know, all the hammers from the merchant. But that's a different instance than, say, another playing group coming to the same city and visiting the same merchant. They are in their own instance, and they don't have those hammers missing in most cases. So they have bubbled up, floated up from the setting, their own instances, which create scenes of play that emerge and keep on developing. Somebody then could, for example, after the game session, let's say they, I don't know, burn down part of the merchant's house, create like maybe an addition to the setting, or which others can take maybe canon or not, which is that now the house is half burned, and somebody might incorporate that. But once again, when they start playing, they create their own instance of it. Like, so these are behaviors that are not really covered by the scene. And they are showing behaviors that are actually very important. That, like, these are qualities that make these settings possible, make this presence of the world possible, but in this sort of network-like manner, which is the possibility of taking its scope into existence, because you cannot like just take everything co-affecting at the same time. So it's these kind of directions that come into play from the perspective of the setting. And like of course one can think about this, like to turn this into practicality, is that this is kind of reflecting the structural possibilities that even this like small internet circles playing an RPG have when they say we're in this setting, which happens now. We create the scene in the city with these characters and this merchant shop, and in this scene there is items, and these kind of behave like the filter layer or chess pieces in a way like when a player is looking at the item, they could be thinking, well, I could buy it, or they could be affected that this item could affect my chances of making myself, say, like this hammer could help me to make, I don't know, a sword or a door lock, which I then could use in another part of the setting, which is not in the sea. It's like in another town. It's their house in another town. And having able to have this wormhole in this manner, and having those as something that the play can address.
Can I come back? Or Pablo, you wanted to say something?
That last time when we talked about this, there was like a moment where it became clear to me, Peko, and was when you said, if you think of the scene as a frame, you can think of the setting as a framework, as a network of frames.
Yeah.
And there I sort of started understanding setting. And then we talked a lot about this duality of the term setting, which is very interesting, that you can say sort of like the setting of this novel is England in the 18th century, but you also have the settings of your operating system where you define the possibilities of the software, right? How do I want it to look? What can I enable or disable? So you have this duality of setting as this provider of scenes in a way, you can think. Yeah, that's it. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, you just
do say.
Yeah, you just messed up my point, Pablo. So thank you.
No,
what I was thinking that, like, because I think, like, I really like this filter layer structure, and I think there's there's the way in which things relate. I was just thinking the following thought though. Even whether you call it now a frame, in which it would always be inside a framework, right? That is the reason why you called it that, why you use those terms to kind of. So, and then inside the frame, there's an, I don't think this is, I mean, it's nested, yes, but it's nested in a not the same way as we have these notion things nesting. Maybe because the visibility goes a bit back and forth in a better way. But let's just say, like, so, and it's just a tryout, I don't know. But if we say we have with this, with the filter, with the layer filter logic, we have one. So you didn't want me to call it top level logic. What do we call it then?
I mean, call it whatever. Like, we can.
Okay, let's call it top level. We forget about that later.
Core loop.
Yeah, but it's not. I'm not sure if you would kind of. So it's the kind of the base logic. Let's call it. Then it's not on the top. Then it's on the bottom. Does it matter?
Yeah. It's like all the terms are slightly problematic.
Everything is wrong.
Like, everything.
Okay, let's be wrong in the forward way. So, like, okay, so if we say with the layer filter thing, we have a base logic, and then there's another base logic which would, for example, be hierarchical nesting, setting, scene, object, blah 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 blah. So it kind of I'm trying to avoid to come too close to kind of a physical resemblance, but it does have a bit of that. I don't know if it's a necessary relationship. I do not know. Like, I'm trained to think that way. So is it a maybe good exercise / was that maybe what you were trying already, to seek whether these base level logics could kind of cross exist in one kind of application, so to speak, so that you can kind of handle both of them in a dimensional crossroads that we can't even know which dimension that now is, but like, so
yeah, that's the point. That's the
right
point.
that they would be kind of multiplied with one another in a sense. I get that. Okay, so but then I would just kind of want to at this point already mark out that I do not, that if we undertake this exercise, I would not want to stop at just these two. So we need to find minimally a third one, if not more, of what could be such base level logics that are kind of characteristically so different from these two already, that we can, because otherwise I feel that there's this kind of magnetism to kind of, you know, fight it out. And, you know, I don't think that's interesting.
Yeah, I like this kind of like finding this particular terms, conceptions has been attempt towards that, like finding these logics, and it's certainly not finished at all. But I do think there are kind of good structures here. One key thing I would say about the settings, though, and this is also why the perspectivism, like running through this, is a key. Like nothing is. Everything is just seen as, or operated as is a better term, in a certain way, and selected to be operated as, say, a scene or a layer filter or whatever it is. And this is also true of the setting, because there is no need for the setting to exist. But there is also a possibility then to take what, say, happened in the scene and make it setting-like writing it down and like yeah. So it's not in this sense stop, because like you can like say at the start of the play, or even as a continuance of the play, you just have a scene, for example, and then you have some layer filters, like in a way like what was happening here in this play. There was a scene, and then there was like in the scene there were some starting conditions, but they were part of the scene, and then like pieces were added. It's like a continuing scene, emerging and developing by layer filters affecting each other. That's what happened there.
Can I draw something?
Yeah.
I was just thinking, and thank you, technology, for helping me a bit on this here. Like, I was just thinking what you were doing there just now, Pekko, was a bit kind of this, you know, type changing thing. So there was some, I just recall that you talked about scene, but there were other things that you kind of then, you know, called it a scene at some point, or the scene could also be kind of dissolved in a way. It reminded me of this thing that you can actually do. I'm not getting royalties, but like, or like in Notion, like that you can change type of a thing.
Yeah.
So that's maybe also a mechanism that I mean, that kind of would kind of almost kind of want to fall down back, I guess, on this kind of context likeness, because then it doesn't matter what type it is, because it's anyway context to each other in any kind of shape-shifting thing way. But I thought that was an interesting.
Yeah, it's a good observation, and I think it's kind of like the extreme, or the most flexible version of this quality. That's the kind of perspectivism, or it's one reflection of that perspectivism in and of itself. And it's really about this sort of different operative types serving different possibilities, like being aware that it's possible to approach the thing as a setting opens up these possibilities. Like to take a practical example again, is like, let's say there are these people who start some RPG session simply having the first description, which happens. Like people do this. Like some people like this approach. Like they describe this sort of scene on a pathway and some characters and so on, and they don't have the setting, they don't have the world essentially around it. But then once they play, like after this session, they actually write down some of the things to start to use what they generated through playing of scenes, or even a continuous scene, towards a setting presence. Like they write down the village name and they write, which they ended up on the pathway, which was just improvised, but then they actually kind of describe this village and maybe even continue to work on the setting level that they, oh, okay, there's this village, but that means that there must be, you know, this other village because somebody talked about the other people, and then they create that on a setting level. It's not even done as a playing scene in like with the other players, and they write that down. And then when the playing starts again, a new scene is opened, and then the players or the characters actually travel to this other village, which is then generated from this this network of different things that that other village was in the setting. Like these are all actually, I think, very useful qualities that come from how these perspectives can play with each other. Like it's a certain flexibility, which is, I would say, way beyond what is the structural thinking behind, say, metaverse, or certainly beyond like this, almost like a lock of the concept of the network, because everything is a network, but then that concept doesn't really say much. This is much more talking about structural patterns that enable this behavior to be as flexible as possible, but then also capable of creating different kind of situations and different kind of processes, which of course, to say that word, is key for organizations as well.
Different kind of what?
Capabilities, I think, was, if you meant that.
Those you mentioned two, and I like pick either. Yeah, sorry, I was just thinking another thought.
Another good example that we mentioned last time was sort of like how it emerges naturally from video game mechanics, how certain video game mechanics spawn entire genre of games, and how sort of like this scene becomes a setting in the way that something that becomes particularly engaging then spawns variations of it that are scenes in themselves. So yeah, kind of in this not nested but fractal nature.
Yeah, fractal and kind of network like
exactly.
Yeah, like it's kind of like playing that game, but then actually separating out of it. Like, oh, what makes this game like this? It's this particular feature. Like, I don't know, like you take Dark Souls, and then it's like this sort of immanence of death, and then the structures that it uses to create this sort of mysterious feel to the world, that how the information is separated. But here you're already making this sort of network nodes, like certain kind of nodes. But then you use those to kind of, okay, I generate another game, but these are my guidelines. Kind of like I want to create this sort of this kind of style of information that Dark Souls uses, but I create it slightly different way. And now you're in a genre, like now you're utilizing the genre-like qualities and turning that game into a genre. But that kind of is already, structurally speaking, dipping yourself into the setting, dipping yourself into network like qualities.
Yeah. And I have a slight intuition that this is how many things that we today just take for granted emerged.
Yes.
Like I'm sure there was probably a moment where there was only one board game and people just called it the board game because it was the game that was played on a board.
Yes.
And then boards just became this massive engine of settings, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very historical notion, probably wrong in many ways, but it's a intuition I have.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not just board games, but really like human culture, like in all forms. Like somebody creates a place to serve drinks, and then there comes another person who starts to make the same thing, and then this taking learnings from how the other person did it, and then you have bars or cafes or whatever, like, and like, but it's a sort of interesting dip in between, and which is also connected to rule-like things or ops, as the document has it, which is among my favorite concepts in the last developments. But we can. I don't know if we want to dip into that, like for now.
I will have to leave soon, but you can continue with Martin if he's interested. I'm deep in
No,
the
I
ops.
also think that it would be nice, because there's a couple left that we didn't really talk, or we didn't go into these. I think that it could be good to also maybe wrap at this point.
Yeah. Let's
also
wrap
maybe
it.
we should have a few minutes after the age of recording ends.
Yeah. So, like, essentially what we went through was the sort of layer filter, or here called framer, but like the idea of the layer filter, those dual behavior is the key thing about it. And then we talked about the typer, which I think is kind of like, we even had a conversation about this, like that whether it needs a kind of term of its own, but on the other hand, there was this practicalness to it, like having this like notion of pointing out what you're doing when you're naming something a role and expecting things to kind of nest underneath it. And I mean, it's the whole human categorical approach, which the type and typer is doing. And then the scene and setting we talked about a lot. Like what is left is kind of like the op or ops and the oxel itself. I wouldn't maybe dive into oxel because it's twisty and tricky. I think it's really interesting. It's like what happens when you do a perspectivist pixel. Like it's not a point; it's a monad. Like
Are you trying to wrap up, Pekka? Is that what's happening here?
I'm just making these as mysterious questions. That's my very bad attempt of wrapping up. Like these are just left as questions in the ether. You can think about them.
Cliffhanger Koskinen.
Yeah. But I really think it's kind of potential. Like whether one calls it oxel or whatever, but that actual structure is really interesting, especially in relation to organizations. Like that you have something that behaves like a pixel, like an atomic, but it's not really an atom, it's a perspective, and it can contain other atoms. So it's not undividable. Okay, I'll shut up. And then the op, in the shortest form, is, I think, a solution of this whole whether to call things rules or not, because the rules are kind of everywhere, but then you can think that certain things are rules. There is an approach, I think, that opened with this op, which is short for operations, but like to also separate it, which I think is quite nifty, but we can talk about that later. Anyway, all of this, I might be wrong, and you might disagree at the end, but I truly think that this is actually, I think we share the same emphasis on this layer filter, and that was the whole point, like how to break up the OPOC and rather make a system that serves that layer filter, starts from it and builds around it so that it doesn't damage it. Because that key lightness but flexibility of play was something like that was the lighthouse, and then this was kind of trying to build around that lighthouse so that it's more into the service of that rather than the kind of trying to limit it or cut it into pieces. So yeah, that's
and obviously the lighthouse and today's session each being context-like onto each other.
Yes, and this is precisely what is perspectivist approach makes capable. Everything is a context. Everything is a pixel. They can be even that at the same time. It all depends on how you want to use it at every moment. All right, but hey, yes. Do say.
Okay. No. I just wanted to do some advertising for the next session. But that's fine. You did.
You could, yes. That would be possible.
All of this and more to come next Friday.
Yes. So, but I think it once again we kind of skipped from our like initial descriptions, but they are only proposals anyway. And I do think this conversation was very useful. I do think, like, also Martin, the point you started with is actually extremely important, and something that could have been made damage to if it wouldn't have been brought strongly out. Like I said, I was thinking along the same lines, with certain details you pointed out were, I think, really important to bring out. So yeah, I think it was a really good session on this.
Keep chiseling.
Anyway, I'll stop sharing and restart my buggy video, which keeps on crashing also. But yes, any last comments?
Many more, but for next session, I'd guess. Yeah.
All right. Then those could be the last words as a awkward advertisement.
And we need to hang on for like 5 more
Yeah,
minutes.
yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
I'll stop the recording.